You think your opinions are yours? Most of them aren't. Not entirely. Not the ones that arrived through repetition, through the social environment you grew up in, through the media you consumed before you were old enough to question it, through the groups whose approval you needed. Those opinions weren't formed, they were installed. And the process by which they were installed uses the same psychological mechanisms that governments spent billions of classified dollars trying to weaponize, and that still operate on you, continuously, in environments you'd never identify as dangerous. This video is the investigation into a vulnerability in your mind that you were never taught existed. By the end, you'll have a map of how it works, inside CIA laboratories in the 1950s, inside the recruitment rooms of organizations you'd recognize as cults, and inside the interface of your phone right now. The mechanism is the same in all three places, only the scale and the intent have changed. Let's begin with what brainwashing actually is. Not the movie version. The term itself has an interesting history. It's a translation of a Chinese phrase, xinao, that emerged in the early 1950s to describe psychological coercion techniques used in Maoist China on political prisoners and captured foreign nationals. When American soldiers who had been prisoners of war in Korea returned home in 1953, several of them had renounced the United States, praised their captors, and signed statements confessing to war crimes they hadn't committed. The American public was disturbed. How could ordinary American men be turned against their country? What had been done to their minds? The CIA was asking the same question, and their response was a program that would remain classified for 2 decades and that, when its contents were finally revealed to the Senate in 1977, produced testimony from Senator Ted Kennedy that the program involved covert drug tests on unwitting citizens at all social levels, high and low, Native Americans and foreign. The program was called MKUltra. It began on April 13, 1953, authorized by CIA Director Allen Dulles and led by Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist with a club foot who had developed a taste for folk dancing and spent his professional life trying to find the chemical key to human consciousness. The classified budget ran into millions of dollars annually. The scope extended across more than 30 universities and research institutions. The methods included LSD administered without consent, hypnosis, electroshock, sensory deprivation, and what one internal document described as techniques to induce regression and later amnesia. At a CIA safe house in New York, a federal narcotics agent named George White dosed unwitting guests with LSD and observed them from behind a 2-way mirror. At the Allen Memorial Institute, a psychiatric hospital at McGill University in Montreal, a psychiatrist named Dr. Ewan Cameron conducted experiments he called depatterning. Extended drug-induced sleep combined with electroshock and continuous audio messages played on loop to subjects who were either unconscious or semi-conscious. His goal was to erase the existing personality and replace it with something more manageable. Subjects emerged from Cameron's care with severe memory loss. Some couldn't recognize family members. Some lost years of their lives. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MKUltra records. What survived was discovered by accident during an unrelated Freedom of Information Act search in 1977. Roughly 20,000 documents in a records facility the destruction order had missed. Those documents revealed the program's scope. They also revealed its fundamental conclusion. After more than a decade of classified research across hundreds of experiments and millions of dollars, the CIA's mind control program had failed to achieve its central objective. You could drug someone, you could confuse and disorient them, you could damage them severely. But you couldn't reliably install a new belief system in someone who didn't, at some level, already want to accept it. The external force couldn't do what the researchers had hoped. The mind, it turned out, resisted crude invasion. But here's what the CIA was discovering in their black-budget laboratories at the same moment a psychiatrist named Robert J. Lifton was discovering something far more important in public view. Lifton had spent years studying the Chinese thought reform programs that had produced the confessions and conversions the CIA was trying to replicate by force. He interviewed survivors, Westerners who had been through Chinese political indoctrination programs, Chinese citizens who had been through thought reform campaigns, and what he found reversed the entire frame of the question. Brainwashing, when it actually worked, when it produced genuine, durable changes in belief, identity, and behavior, didn't work through force. It worked through community, through belonging, through the systematic restructuring of a person's entire information environment and social world until the new belief system was the only available framework for making sense of reality. He published his findings in 1961 in a book called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. It identified 8 specific criteria, 8 interlocking conditions that, when present simultaneously in an environment, produce the psychological state that enables genuine thought reform. Not temporary compliance. Actual transformation of belief. The creation of a person who genuinely holds the new world view and experiences the old one as foreign or corrupt. Here are the 8 criteria. Listen carefully, because by the end of this list, you'll have already started recognizing them somewhere beyond a history book. First, milieu control. Control of information and communication within the environment, and ultimately within the individual. Lifton described this as isolation from the broader society, combined with control over what information reaches the person and how it's interpreted. Second, mystical manipulation. The orchestration of experiences that appear spontaneous but are in fact staged, designed to demonstrate the special authority of the leader or the group. Manufactured moments of revelation that make the ideology feel confirmed by experience rather than adopted by choice. Third, demand for purity. A rigidly binary worldview, pure versus impure, saved versus lost, enlightened versus ignorant. Guilt and shame used as primary control mechanisms. The constant pressure to conform more completely, believe more totally, eliminate the remaining impurities of the old self. Fourth, the cult of confession. The transformation of personal disclosure from a path toward genuine self-knowledge into a mechanism of surveillance and control. You confess your doubts, your deviations, your private reservations. And in doing so, you hand the group a map of your vulnerabilities. Fifth, sacred science. The ideology of the group is beyond question. It is not subject to scrutiny, revision, or rational examination. Anyone who challenges it isn't raising a legitimate point, they're revealing their own corruption or ignorance. Sixth, loading the language. The development of a specialized vocabulary that shapes thought rather than just describing it. Thought-terminating cliches, phrases that shut down inquiry rather than opening it. Language that identifies who belongs and who doesn't, and that makes it increasingly difficult to think in terms outside the ideology's framework. Seventh, doctrine over person. When your direct experience conflicts with the ideology's teachings, your experience is wrong. Your doubt is evidence of your impurity, not evidence against the doctrine. You learn to distrust your own perception. Eighth, dispensing of existence. The in-group has value, the out-group does not. Those outside the ideology are not just mistaken, they are lost, corrupt, dangerous, or irredeemably other. The boundary between member and non-member becomes the boundary between people who matter and people who don't. Now here's the pattern interrupt that changes everything about this list. You don't need a compound in Guyana or a re-education camp in 1950s China for these conditions to operate. You need a sufficiently closed information environment, a sufficiently strong identity group, and a sufficiently consistent set of signals about who belongs and who doesn't. And those conditions are reproducible at scale, in ordinary life, through mechanisms that don't look like brainwashing because they look like everything else. Think about what milieu control looks like when the milieu is digital, when the algorithm that determines what you see, in your feed, in your recommendations, in the search results that feel like a neutral window into reality, has been calibrated to maximize your engagement rather than your accuracy. When the information environment you spend 7 to 10 hours a day inside has been shaped, continuously and invisibly, by systems whose objective function is to keep you returning, not to keep you well-informed. In 2018, a whistleblower named Christopher Wiley testified before the British Parliament about the work he had done for a data analytics firm called Cambridge Analytica. The firm had harvested personal data from approximately 87 million Facebook profiles without meaningful consent, and used it to construct psychological profiles of American voters, categorized by their susceptibility to specific emotional and cognitive appeals. Those profiles were then used to deliver precisely targeted political messaging, different arguments to different personality types, each calibrated to the specific fears and values and identity commitments that the data said would be most effective. Wiley described it as building a machine that could identify the psychological vulnerabilities of a population and exploit them at industrial scale, not manufacturing new beliefs out of nothing, finding existing beliefs, fears, and identity commitments, and constructing an information environment that made them louder, more certain, more isolated from contrary evidence. Loading the language, milieu control, dispensing of existence. The algorithm surfaces content that reinforces the boundary between us and them, because outrage about them produces more engagement than curiosity about complexity. Sacred science, the platform's engagement dynamics, reward certainty and punish nuance, because nuance generates fewer responses than conviction. You don't need a CIA handler or a cult leader for the 8 criteria to begin operating in your life. You need a feed. But here's where the investigation requires something uncomfortable from you. Because the process Lifton documented doesn't just happen in digital spaces or controlled environments or organizations with charismatic leaders. It happens in the mind itself, in the specific cognitive mechanisms that make human beings susceptible to thought reform in the first place. The psychologist Leon Festinger, in his 1957 work on cognitive dissonance, identified something that connects all of these threads. When a person has invested significantly in a belief, particularly when they've made that investment socially visible, particularly when their identity has become organized around the belief, the mind doesn't respond to contradictory evidence by updating the belief. It responds by rejecting the evidence, by finding reasons why the contradictory data is wrong, biased, corrupted, produced by the enemy, beside the point. The mind protects its investments the way a lawyer defends a client, not by seeking the truth, but by building the strongest possible case for the position already held. This is what Lifton called doctrine over person. It doesn't require external enforcement. Given sufficient investment in a belief, sufficient identity fusion, sufficient social cost to revision, the mechanism runs automatically inside the individual without any instruction from outside. The thought reform environment creates the conditions for it to begin. Once it begins, it generates its own fuel. This is the vulnerability. This is what the CIA was trying to artificially produce through drugs and electroshock and sleep deprivation, and failed to achieve, and what happens naturally, gradually, invisibly, in any sufficiently closed information environment with sufficiently high social stakes for belief revision. Here's the practical question the investigation demands. How do you detect it in yourself? Not in a cult, not in a government program, in the beliefs you carry right now, in the information environment you actually inhabit, in the opinions you would defend if challenged, and the sources you'd reach for to defend them. Lifton identified one indicator that operates before the others. He called it the shutdown of genuine inquiry, the specific moment when a question stops producing thought and starts producing a preloaded response. When you notice that your reaction to a challenge to one of your beliefs is not curiosity, but something closer to threat, when the question itself feels dangerous rather than interesting. That is the indicator that something has been installed rather than reasoned toward. The healthy mind doesn't treat uncertainty about its own beliefs as a crisis. It treats it as information. The thought-reformed mind, regardless of what it's been reformed toward, responds to uncertainty about its beliefs the way the body responds to infection, with a defensive immune reaction designed to eliminate the intrusive element rather than learn from it. Genuine inquiry feels different. It has a quality of openness to the answer you might find, even if the answer would require you to change something significant. It doesn't produce the same physiological signature of mild threat that accompanies the defense of an identity-fused belief. You can tell the difference between these two states if you pay attention to them, and the fact that you can tell the difference is the only protection that actually works. The CIA spent 11 years and millions of dollars trying to find a chemical shortcut to what Lifton showed happens through community, repetition, and information control. They failed. But the phenomenon they were studying, the capacity of the human mind to be restructured by sufficiently sustained and total environmental influence, was real then, and is real now. It's happening across the political spectrum, across religious and secular communities, across every sufficiently closed group that offers identity and belonging in exchange for belief revision. The question the title asked, "Could you be brainwashed without knowing it?" has a specific answer. Yes. Under conditions of sufficient milieu control, sufficient identity investment, and sufficient social cost to revision, the 8 criteria Lifton identified can begin operating without your awareness or consent. The process doesn't announce itself. It presents itself as clarity, as finally understanding what's really going on, as being part of something that sees the truth that others have missed or refused to face. That feeling, the specific quality of certainty that comes from having your information environment, your social world, and your identity all aligned and mutually confirming, is both the most compelling experience a thought reform environment produces and the most reliable warning sign that the process has begun. You started this video with opinions you thought were yours. Some of them are. Some of them arrived through processes neither you nor anyone around you fully understood or chose. The difference between those two categories is not immediately visible from the inside, but the question itself, the willingness to ask it honestly, without knowing in advance what the answer will be, is the counter, not to specific beliefs, to the closure of inquiry itself. The mind that can still genuinely ask whether its beliefs were formed or installed is the mind that hasn't yet been fully reformed. Keep asking.